At 19, Leila Carter felt as if her whole world had been locked away from her. She stood in front of the small mirror in her room, her wedding dress heavy on her thin shoulders. The lace was fine, the color pure white, and yet it felt like chains. Outside she could hear voices, the town preparing for the wedding that everyone would talk about for months. Her father had made the choice for her. He said Elias Monroe was a good man, steady and strong, a man who would take care of her and the Carter family. But Lila did not know him. She had seen him only a few times from a distance. He had calm eyes and a quiet voice, but behind that calm there was something that made her uneasy. She did not want this marriage, yet her father's word was final. The wedding took place on a bright spring morning. The church bells rang loud and the whole town seemed to gather. People dressed in their best clothes and smiled as if they knew something wonderful was about to happen. Lila could hear them whisper as she walked down the aisle, her arms stiff in her father's grip. Some said she looked like a doll, too pale and too still. Others said Elias was lucky to marry such a pretty girl. Lila did not hear all the words, but she felt the eyes following her every step. Elias stood waiting near the altar, tall and serious in his gray suit. He bowed slightly when she reached him. His touch was polite but not warm. When the minister spoke, Lila's heart felt heavy. Her mouth formed the words of the vow, but inside she trembled. Elias said his part calmly, his voice deep and even. He did not smile, not even once. When the rings were exchanged, his hands were steady. Lila's hands shook so much that the ring almost slipped. The minister blessed them, and the people clapped. Lila forced a small smile. She could not even look at her father, who stood near the front, eyes full of satisfaction. She knew he saw this match as a great step for their family. The Monroes were respected, old money, and powerful. Lila was now part of that world, but she would have traded all of it to feel truly free. At the wedding feast, long tables were filled with food and flowers. People laughed, talked, and danced. Lila sat beside Elias, silent, unable to eat. He spoke politely to the guests, who came to greet them, his manners perfect. To everyone's eyes, he was the image of a gentleman. But there was a stillness around him that made Lila's skin prickle. She kept her eyes on her plate most of the time. When she did dare to look at him, she caught him studying her quietly, not with anger, but with something she could not name. Perhaps pity, perhaps regret. Once, he gently asked if she wanted more cake. She said no, her voice so soft that only he could hear it. As the evening sun began to set, the coach was brought forward to take them to his home on the hill. The Monroe house stood at the edge of town, large and old, surrounded by tall oak trees. The people waved as the couple left. The wheels rolled over the rough road, the air thick with the smell of dust and spring flowers. Lila sat stiffly beside her new husband. He tried to speak. He asked if she was tired. She nodded without raising her eyes. A long silence followed. The only sound was the horses' hooves striking the road. When they reached the gate, she saw the house clearly for the first time. It looked grand, yet lonely. The windows reflected the pink light of sunset, but inside the halls seemed dark. He let her in. The smell of wood and old books filled the air. The housekeeper came forward. Elias spoke a few kind words to her, then turned to Lila and said that she should rest. Her room was large, with tall curtains and fine furniture, yet it felt cold. He hesitated before leaving and said quietly that she could have anything she needed. Before she could answer, he was gone. Lila sat on the edge of the bed and looked around. The room seemed to echo with her own heartbeat. She thought of her home, her mother's gentle laughter, and the little garden she had loved. Now she belonged to a man she barely knew, in a house that felt more like a museum than a home. Outside, an owl called from the woods. Inside, Lila whispered to herself that she would not cry. But tears came anyway, soft and hot against her cheeks. Somewhere deep in her heart, a small hope still lived, though she could not name it yet. She only knew that her life had changed forever, and she did not know what kind of story had just begun. The next morning, Lila woke to the sound of footsteps in the hallway. Sunlight filtered through the curtains, painting soft lines on the wooden floor. For a moment she forgot where she was. Then she saw the tall windows and heavy furniture and remembered. This was her new home, the Monroe estate, far from the streets where she had grown up. She rose slowly and looked at the small table near the window. A steaming cup of tea waited there, along with a slice of bread and honey. She had not asked for breakfast. Someone must have thought of it for her. She guessed it was the housekeeper, an older woman with silver hair who had smiled kindly the night before. When Lila stepped out into the hallway, she noticed how quiet the house was. Her shoes made faint sounds against the patterned floor. Paintings lined the walls, showing faces of people who must have been Monroe's long ago. Their eyes seemed to follow her as she walked. A faint chill ran through her body. Every room she passed looked perfect and untouched. It felt as if no one truly lived there. She wondered where Elias was. She found him in the study, a large room filled with books and old maps. He stood near the window reading a letter. When he saw her, he straightened and gave a short nod. His manner was polite but reserved. He asked if she had slept well. She replied with a simple yes. They exchanged a few quiet words. Lila tried to read his face, but he gave nothing away. She wanted to ask why he had agreed to this marriage, if he had ever wanted it, but she did not dare. After a while, he said he had to attend some business in town. He told her to make herself comfortable. When he left, the house became even quieter. Lila walked through the rooms, touching the furniture as if to be sure it was real. She found the kitchen, where the housekeeper, Mrs. Wynne, was kneading bread. The woman's hands moved with strong rhythm. She smiled and said, "The master is a good man, just quiet." Lila nodded but did not answer. There was kindness in Mrs. Wynne's eyes, yet her words sounded as if she was trying to comfort her. Lila went outside to the garden, where the air was fresh and sweet. The garden stretched wide, full of trees and flowers that had once been cared for, but now grew untidy. She could hear birds singing somewhere in the branches. She spent the afternoon there, wandering among the paths. She found a bench near a small pond. The water reflected the blue of the sky. She thought maybe she could paint here one day if anyone would let her. Thinking about painting made her heart ache. Her brushes and colors were still packed in the trunk brought from her father's house. They smelled of freedom and hope, things that seemed far away now. When the sun began to set, Elias returned. Lila watched from the window as he walked from his carriage. He moved with calm steps, his coat neat and his face serious. At dinner, they ate together at the long table where only two places were set. The candles cast flickering light across the plates. Elias asked if she had explored the garden. She said yes, and that it was beautiful but lonely. He looked at her a moment before replying that most beautiful things were a little lonely. His voice sounded distant but thoughtful. Later that night, Lila sat by her window again. She saw Elias walking outside, his figure outlined by the silver moonlight. He stopped near the pond and stared for a long while. She wondered what thoughts filled his mind. Something about his stillness made her heart soften. Maybe there was a story behind his quiet ways, something heavy he did not share. Days turned to weeks, and Lila started to learn the rhythm of the house. Elias left each morning for work in town and returned only by evening. He never raised his voice. He was always gentle, yet there was a distance between them like a wall none of them could cross. Still, she began to notice small acts that made her uncertain. Once she found her broken paintbrush, mended neatly and placed back in her box. Another time she saw a new canvas leaning against her window, the exact kind she had mentioned missing during dinner. He never said a word about these things, and she did not ask. One afternoon it began to rain, and she sat, watching the drops slide down the glass. Thunder rolled across the sky. Elias came back early that day, his coat wet and his hair darkened by the storm. He saw her watching and asked if she was frightened. She said no, but her hands told another story. He then lit the fire for her himself, instead of calling a servant. For the first time, when their eyes met, she did not look away. As days passed, the fear that had filled her heart at the wedding began to change. It was not gone completely, but something gentler took root beside it. She still did not understand him. He still did not show his heart easily, yet every small kindness planted tiny seeds of curiosity and hope. Lila began to wonder if she had misjudged him. At night, when the house was dark and still, she sometimes whispered to herself that perhaps this life would not be as empty as she had imagined. She could almost believe that the silence of the big house was waiting not for sorrow, but for two hearts to learn how to speak. The morning sky over the valley was pale and still. Mist curled around the trees outside the Monroe house. Lila sat at her small table, preparing colors on her palette. She had started to paint again, filling her empty hours with quiet work. It helped her heart feel lighter. She often painted flowers from the garden or the way sunlight touched the pond. Sometimes she thought about showing them to Elias, but fear of his cold silence held her back. She still did not know what he truly thought of her being there. Life in the house had settled into a steady pattern. Elias left early and returned late, often carrying papers or letters that he read long into the night. He spoke kindly but never shared much. Still, his presence no longer made her skin tremble the way it once had. She could feel something in him, a weight he did not speak of. One afternoon, while she painted by the window, Mrs. Wynne came in with fresh bread. She sat for a moment beside Leela and said that the townsfolk had begun to talk again. Leela asked what they said, though she was not sure she wanted to know. Mrs. Wynne sighed and said that people were curious about Elias and his fortune. They wondered how he had built such wealth when others were struggling. Some said he had made deals that harmed good men. Others said he had promised something to Leela's father years before. Lila felt her chest tighten. She did not believe her father capable of cheating anyone. But she also did not know what had passed between him and Elias before the marriage. Mrs. Wynne quickly added that most people in town spoke from envy, yet the seed of worry had already been planted. Later that week, Leela went to the market for the first time since her wedding. She wanted new brushes and some fruit. The townspeople noticed her at once. Her smiles looked polite, but their eyes were full of questions. Two women stopped her near the bakery and asked about life in the great house. They said the walls of that place must keep many secrets. Lila smiled weakly and said that it was quiet but peaceful. When she turned away, she could hear them whispering. The words stung, though she tried to ignore them. When she returned home, she found Elias waiting in the front hall. His expression was unreadable. He asked where she had been, and she told him she had gone to town. For a moment his jaw tightened. He reminded her not to listen to gossip and said that people in small towns like to make stories from shadows. She nodded, but his tone carried something she had not heard before, a trace of fear mixed with anger. He started to say more, then stopped and turned away. She watched him climb the stairs, his shoulders tense. That night rain began to fall. Thunder shook the windows and the lights flickered. Lila tried to sleep but could not. The sound of the storm reminded her of the day she had been told she must marry. She rose and walked down the hall to the room where she kept her paintings. There, in the faint glow of the fire, she looked at the portrait she had started of Elias. She had not meant to paint him, but his image had formed almost on its own. His face looked strong, but his eyes carried loneliness. The more she gazed at it, the more she felt her heart twist. She wanted to understand him, yet he kept pushing her away. Suddenly, the doors below slammed, and she heard him pacing in the hall. She hesitated, then went down. Elias was standing by the fire, holding a letter in his hand. His face was pale. He turned sharply when he saw her. She asked if something was wrong. He said only that the past had a way of finding them again. His voice shook slightly. She stepped closer and asked what he meant. He said she had no idea what kind of promise her father had made, and that it might shatter everything if she knew. Lila felt cold inside. She whispered that she had a right to know. He stared at the flames and said that her father had been kind to him once when he was young and poor, but the help had come at a cost. He said that the marriage had been part of that debt, though it was not as simple as it seemed. She cried out, asking if he had married her only to repay a favor. He did not answer. His silence felt heavier than anger. Tears filled her eyes. She turned away and ran back to her room. All night she lay awake, the storm howling around the house. The truth she had feared now felt even worse than she had imagined. Yet deep inside, something told her that Elias's pain was real too. She thought of the gentle acts he had done in secret, how he had fixed her brush or left her favorite tea each morning. Maybe he was trapped by duty as much as she was. By morning, the storm had passed. The world outside looked clean and bright, but inside Leela's heart there was only confusion. She sat by her window and looked toward the hills, unsure of what to believe anymore. She knew one thing, though. She could no longer live with half-truths and silence. The next time Elias tried to hide behind his calm mask, she would not stay quiet. She needed to know who the man beside her truly was and what past bound their lives together. She had feared him once, But now her fear was changing into a fierce need for truth, no matter what it would cost. A new month began with clear skies and warm air. The storm had broken something inside both Lila and Elias. They no longer spoke the way they once did. Their meals were quiet. Their eyes met sometimes, curious yet guarded. Lila went back to her painting, but her work no longer came easily. She kept thinking about his words, about some unknown promise between their fathers that had sealed her future. Every time she looked at him, she felt both hurt and pity. He moved like a man who carried an invisible chain around his heart. One evening, she walked to the old barn behind the house. Inside, she found worn boxes filled with papers and books. Dust rose as she opened them. Many of the papers were letters written in her father's neat hand, addressed to Elias. The early ones spoke of business and gratitude. The later ones grew more serious, filled with talk of debts and land. She could not understand it all, but one letter caught her eye. It said, "I trust you will honor your word when the time comes." Her heart pounded. Now she knew the truth. Whatever had bound them, it had been arranged long before she was grown. The marriage was both repayment and protection. That night she faced Elias in the great room. He was by the fire again, as always. She held the letter in her hand. He looked at her and sighed. For the first time, he did not try to hide behind silence. He said her father had saved his family once, keeping them from ruin. When her father later faced trouble, Elias had vowed to help in return, no matter the cost. But instead of taking money, her father had asked only that Elias would marry Lila and keep her safe from others who wanted their land. He had agreed, seeing it as a duty, never knowing it would cause this much pain. Lila listened with tears in her eyes. She asked if he had ever wanted the marriage for himself. He stood quiet for a long time, then said that at first he thought only of obligation. But then he realized he had grown to care for her, though he dared not show it. She turned away, heart caught between anger and sorrow. He said that life often gave duties first and gifts later. She told him she did not want to be anyone's duty, and ran out before he could speak again. The next day, the town began to stir with new talk. Something unusual was happening, they said. Elias Monroe was planning a gathering in the square. No one knew the reason. He invited the mayor and every family, even children. People were curious. They had always thought him distant, too proud for simple company. Leela heard of it from Mrs. Wynne, but said nothing. She did not expect that it would concern her. On the day of the gathering, the square was bright with ribbons and flowers. Tried to stay home, but Mrs. Wynne insisted that she must go. She arrived just as Elias stepped onto the small wooden stage built in the middle of the square. The crowd quieted. His face was calm, but his eyes searched for her. When he found her in the front row, he gave a small nod and turned to the people. He spoke of kindness and of how people often judged what they did not understand. He said that a man's greatest fortune was not gold or land, but the heart he was trusted to keep safe. He then gestured toward a large structure covered with white cloth behind him. The crowd murmured as the cloth was pulled away. Before them stood a new building made of fine wood and glass. On the front, shining in gold letters, was written the Lila Gallery. Inside the building, every wall held her paintings. The flowers, the gardens, the sunlight, even the quiet portrait of him were all there. He had gathered them without her knowing. He had kept them safe, framed them, and built a place for everyone to see them. The crowd gasped. Her name was painted large across the front, as if it belonged to history. Elias spoke again. He said that art was a gift that should never be caged, and that the town should see how light could grow even from pain. People began to clap, some wiping tears. Lila stood frozen, her eyes filled with water as she realized what he had done. It was not a gift of gold or land, but of trust and belief. The man she had feared had used his power to honor her heart. When the crowd gave way, Elias came to stand beside her. He said quietly that he should have told her sooner, but he had wanted the world to know her worth before she ever doubted it again. She could not answer, only felt warmth rise within her chest. For the first time since their marriage, she felt free, not because she could leave, but because she could stay by her own choice. That night, as the town celebrated in the square, the gallery lights glowed like a promise. The laughter of the townsfolk filled the air. Lila looked up at Elias and saw him not as a stranger or a shadow, but as a man who had carried love in silence, till he found a way to speak it through her art. For the first time, the house on the hill no longer felt like a cage. It felt like home. The night after the grand unveiling stayed quiet except for the distant songs and laughter from the town. Inside the Monroe house, soft candlelight warmed the walls. Lila stood by the window looking down at the valley. From the hill, she could see the gleam of her gallery lights shining like stars in a row. The sight filled her chest with a feeling she had never known before, something between peace and wonder. She had gone to town as a frightened bride months ago, but tonight she was seen by everyone, not as a name on a family paper, but as herself. Elias entered the room behind her without saying anything. He had changed out of the dark suit he had worn earlier. His hands were loosely folded, his face thoughtful. Lila turned to him, unsure of what to say. For a moment they simply looked at each other in the calm glow of the candles. Then he said softly that he had dreamed to see her smile like she did in the square. His voice trembled slightly, as though he feared breaking the silence that had once protected him. Lila stepped closer, her dress rustling against the floor. She asked why he had hidden her paintings for so long. He said he wanted her to see how strong she was before the world did. He said he knew from the start that her talent would speak louder than any of the gossip or lies that surrounded their marriage. Hearing this, she felt her fear lift a little more. She thanked him quietly, smiled, not wide but real, and for the first time she saw how gentle his eyes could be. The next morning, the house woke later than usual. The servants talked of how the whole town was still speaking about the gallery. People who had once looked down on them now called Lila talented and kind. Elias's name, once whispered with doubt, now carried respect. Mrs. Wynne said that the mayor planned to write to a newspaper in the city about the opening. Lila listened while pouring tea and smiled to herself. Her heart no longer felt heavy. In the days that followed, she went off into the gallery. Children came to see the paintings, and she spoke to them with warmth. Some asked her how to paint the color of sunlight, and she showed them how to mix shades on the palette. The people who had once pitied her now greeted her with open smiles. She never forgot how quickly gossip could turn, but she forgave them quietly in her heart. Elias visited the gallery each afternoon, standing quietly as others admired her work. When their eyes met, a soft understanding passed between them. Each day their conversations grew easier. They talked of his work, of her ideas for new paintings, of simple things that had once stayed locked behind silence. Lila found herself laughing more. Sometimes he would watch her for a long time, his expression thoughtful, as if he could not believe she was real. One evening, when the sun was setting behind the hills, Lila led him to the pond in the garden. The still water reflected the colors of the sky. She told him that she had begun to paint a new piece, one about change and forgiveness. He asked what it would look like, and she said it was not finished yet, but that it would show two trees growing side by side, their roots tangled beneath the soil. He nodded slowly and said that seemed a fine way to tell a story. That night she painted until her hands were covered with color. Elias brought her tea and watched from the doorway. He looked proud, not of himself, but of what she had become. When she finally put down her brush, she said she had once believed fear was stronger than love. Now she knew love could be quiet and still win in the end. He reached out his hand, and she placed hers in his without hesitation. Winter came to the valley, bringing cold air and pale skies. Yet inside their home, there was warmth. Fires burned in the hearth, and often laughter echoed down the long hall that had once been silent. Lila's paintings filled not just the gallery but the rooms of their house. Each canvas told a part of their story, turning memories into color. Elias had learned to speak more of his heart, while she had learned to listen without fear. What had begun as an unwanted duty had grown into a life built on choice and hope. Years later, children would point to the house on the hill and ask about the couple who had once lived there. People would tell how a young woman who had feared her husband came to love him deeply, and how his wedding gift had changed not only one heart, but the whole town. The story became a quiet legend of its own, a reminder that love could grow even in the most unlikely soil. And in the evenings, when the sun dipped low and the lights from the Lila Gallery glowed across the valley, it seemed the world itself smiled, proud of the love that had found its home there.